confront me when I'm saying, okay, what about the rural areas? How do you provide access to electricity? These people say, well, we extend the grid, and the grid will be extended, so why should we think of decentralized solutions? And then I say, well, but the grid might not be good, and this is like my starting point where I try to say, okay, but you're waiting for a grid, but the grid might not be doing what you expect the grid to be doing. And I'm sure there are countries which already also invest in the grid in a good way, so the grid power will be good, but I think it's not happening everywhere.
Other questions? Comments? Yes, please.
What I wanted to know was, like, even in the USA, when they first started the rural electrification, it was not a decentralized one. Like, if you think of any country, it was always the grid-driven one. We don't have any empirical evidence of decentralized electrification leading to the entire rural areas being electrified. I said, so based on that, can you have any comments on your that kind of a thing work in countries like sub-Saharan Africa? And
thank you. Maybe just a quick comment. I think there was a similar comment from Peter Adelman in some of the sessions. He took the example of Germany when he was saying, well, in Germany now you have all this decentralized electricity supply. And it's true, it started off with the grid, and it was very centralized. There was hydropower and coal and all that stuff. But I think now, when you look at the renewable energy potential, which is a really local potential, I think it's a very great opportunity to use the resources which you have available in one place. So you don't need to look at this very complex issue of building a centralized power plant and all these related transmission if you have already resources in one place. And I think this is the only thing why it happens in Germany now, because PV prices got really cheap. Well, there was a governmental agenda, and they said, okay, let's make it an opportunity to invest in the decentralized system. So everyone was putting on PV on the roofs because it was just the local renewable resource, which was not there in the 150 years ago. That's my thoughts on it, but I'm happy to have a discussion.
Final quick question. Yeah.
It is not true from a historical perspective that electrification has always been centralized in Germany. It actually, in some areas, it started out quite decentralized on something what we call a district level, probably. So it was like local utilities on district level who made the first steps in some areas. In some areas it was different. But just to keep that in mind, in this paradigm that centralized systems are, let's say, by natural law, more efficient or more economically more productive, or it's something that was just like that emerged in the 1930s. So I wouldn't make this general statement that it was all about centralized systems actually from the beginning.
Yeah, I can just agree to that.
So yeah.
Okay. So thanks again, Katerina, and give her an applause. Right? So I think indeed this was a really nice introduction to what the other presenter is going to talk about, because indeed, like, how did this grid dependency develop, right? I think that's a topic that Jonas van der Straat is going to talk about when he's developing his historical analysis of the grid electrification in Tanzania, right? Please.
Thank you very much. I realized I need a third hand because I hit the trigger of the microphone and my mouse was a pet, but maybe you have to just give you time to switch
to the next slide. So probably the very first question I should answer here is, what am I doing here? My academic background is history of technology. I've also been working as a consultant in the field of decentralized energy supply. And what I'm actually trying to do, and I would try to do with your help, is connecting, let's say, the very macro perspective from the roof of a historian with the micro perspective we have on the field. And if you go to the next slide. It's a very simple problem I'd like to give an answer to, which is the issue of urban-rural disparities in nearly every electrification process the world has seen so far. It's particularly drastic in Tanzania. So actually the first power generator was installed about 100 years ago in 1906, and 100 years later, after 100 years history of electrification of the country, there was a total electrification rate of 10%. Now it's actually risen during the last years, but it was 100 years later in 2006. While in Dar es Salaam, the capital city, about 60% of the population had access to electricity. Other urban areas had 30%, and rural areas had a mere 1%. Rural electrification was more or less, depending on how you define it, inexistent. So I would argue, and that's the central argument of my presentation, that you need a historical perspective to understand this disparity, and it's not enough to conceptualize this as a technical and economical problem as it is usually done. And as a consequence, the solution to this is not a purely economic and technical one. So why is there so little, or actually, let me state that there's electricity in Africa has very little studied by people from social sciences, by people from humanities. Literature, especially historical literature, is nearly inexistent. It's probably because it's too technical for social scientists to venture into, but there's really few literature in this. In the same time, what we see is legacy infrastructures in these countries. So actually they're much more a result of decisions taken 20 years ago, 30 years ago, of capital investment. Who was to benefit from electricity at all? What should electricity be used for? Of an energy modernity. How could electricity contribute to social and economic development? So I would argue that throughout the whole history of the country, for different reasons, the rural poor's needs were marginalized in these discourses. So and this is actually a perspective which has also a result of what we call the cultural turn in the historiography of electricity, that it is regarded essentially a result of societal communication about the potentials, needs, and consequences of electricity. So there has been a lot of research for Europe in this field of people who say it was not, let's say, a natural law or technical laws or some kind of technical determination or some kind of structural factors, the availability of water power or whatever, that has determined the electrification of these countries. It was basically about how people, how engineers, how policymakers, how investors talked and thought about electricity and how they communicated this in discourses. So let us take a tour through the electrification of Tanzania. This is actually based on a PhD thesis, and in this PhD thesis I'm looking at the narratives, especially narratives of modernization, development, which have guided the electricity policy of Tanzania. So I'm looking into Tanzania, if that was not clear so far. And I try to figure out, like, how did these ideas of electricity, how did they materialize? And of course, they materialized in a kind of interplay between public, private, local, and international actors in a field of what we call political economy. And of course, structural elements play a role, but we won't focus on that so much right now. So let us take a short tour through, let's say, the history of electricity in Tanzania. So it started out during colonial reign. Tanzania used to be a colony, first a German colony, then a British colony, and this legacy is a very decisive factor even today for how this infrastructure was shaped. So actually, colonial service provision, electricity service provision, was highly racialized. Racialized means there was a notion among a lot of colonial planners that Africans, native Africans, have no desire for electricity. Hence, there is no market for electricity. So they basically focused on the supply of the small European and in Tanzania also Indian minority in the cities. So you see a map of Dar es Salaam in the 1920s showing the different settlement areas of Europeans and Indians, and the grid was only there. And there's a lot more, you have a lot of research on this kind of racialized urban service provision, different infrastructures in urban studies and geography. So there were generators, small-scale generators in the cities, and if you go to the next slides, there were generators not in rural areas or upcountry towns, but in areas where there were some cash crop farms, or like there were some mines, or anything that would bring benefits to the colonial metropole, which was Britain. So there was, at first there was a perspective on the colonies called constructive imperialism. It was the idea that colonies are a kind of dominus or something. You should get profit. You should get some value for the owner of these colonies, which is Great Britain. So you squeeze out as much value as you can, by for example planting cash crops, by getting fossil resources, and also developing these as markets for the British power industry. This was not about job creation, this idea of development. This was not about social services. So all investment would actually flow into that, and that was also the case for the power sector. So the first hydropower plant, larger hydropower plant built in Tanzania was to serve the sisal plantation. Sisal is the kind of fiber you use for making ropes. So that was the biggest industry. And in general, very little capital was flowing into Tanzania because its status as a colony was not clear. It was like the neighboring countries, Kenya, Rhodesia, were much more attractive. So this is one of the reasons why at the end of the colonial time there was, compared also to other colonies, to other countries of the developing world, Tanzania had one of the smallest electricity infrastructures worldwide because there was not much, it was not attractive for British investors. And the notion of development changed before and during World War II. Also, after the British had lost India, they realized, okay, this policy of just extracting value does not really work. We have to provide some social services and we have to provide the benefits. But still, there was a very important, they distinguished between what they would see like the productive world, the wage laborers, also the African wage laborers working on the, for example, on the plantation, which would generate some value, and the people on the countryside, most of them subsistence farmers, and they were regarded kind of outside of this productive world, outside of the world where people get schooling, where they get social housing, which already included some like electrical lights. So, and I think, and in all development programs, it was rather a question like, how can we get people into the productive world, but not about how can we develop the rural areas. So this was way out of question, and still domestic electricity supply for Africans until the 1960s was far out of range. But electricity became a kind of common feature of urban life. So you had cinemas, you had clubs, and also for a lot of African dwellers in native African dwellers in the cities, this had become a part of their urban life, and this also differentiated them from the rural areas. And they would come home to the village and say, well, this is like this is a step back into the traditional world. So even there, this kind of paradigm, right? So still no perspective for Africans to get electricity. So at the end of the British colonial rule in Tanzania, there was a high pressure to prove the benefits of the colonial rule. And there were large development programs. For example, dam building. Where were these dam buildings, if you go to the next slide, where was the dam constructions inspired from? There's the Tennessee Valley Authority. Does anyone know the Tennessee Valley Authority? It's the granddaddy of all development programs in the United States. And if you go to the next slide, this was actually copied by many late colonial and also early post-independence governments in Africa. So African engineers would be invited to the US to this large dam, to this regional development program. They would learn about how to do this, and they would bring their ideas to Africa, and this was a kind of winning paradigm that regional development programs are actually what should be done to develop these newly independent countries. And there's a certain perspective behind this. There's a very interesting book you saw, this kind of, this book, Seeing Like a State, you don't have to go back. And it tries to take the perspective of these states, of these development states, mostly authoritarian development states, which have to find a way to kind of systematically develop the nation states. Unfortunately, these new nation states are something very fuzzy, very chaotic. So what you have to do, you have to get numbers, you have to aggregate it. This was also the time where development economics became popular. So this kind of model-based thinking, which was derived from the industrializing experience in the global West. So you can only apply models if you have numbers. Okay. So how do you put development into numbers? You have to select, and you definitely develop a bias. And electricity lends itself perfectly to this bias, because you can measure electricity, you can measure megawatts, you can measure development in megawatts. And that's why these dams were so attractive for the new actors coming to the market. So before there was this bilateral relationship between the colonies and Britain, now you had for example, the Swedish development aid coming on the market without any with this moral superiority. We don't have any colonial legacy, but also with the industry, developed industry on hydropower back home, and they are now looking for new markets. So there was also like an attractive market for them. So they promoted these large dams, and it was funnily an African socialist government promoting small is beautiful, promoting rural productivity increase. But still they built this big dam, and money was channeled, a lot of international money was channeled in these big dams. And the electricity produced in these big dams would be transmitted to the capital city. It would not benefit the rural population at all. So again, the rural population, even this paradigm of rural development, was left out. So if you go further, there's a very nice quote, and I can actually use this as one of the last slides. If you go back one. I already mentioned this yesterday. This was about the construction of a large hydropower dam in Tanzania, the largest until today, and the backbone of the power system. And the question was, in the planning process, do we use this dam only for single-purpose electricity generation, or do we use the benefit of irrigation? And this is the quote of one World Bank consultant who said, money should be made to talk. Each one of these parties should be made to weigh the money value of their wishes against the cost to be covered. In this respect, power seems to be superior. Opinions are divided as to the relative benefits in the future, but one thing is absolutely certain. Plans for power are much more definite and much more accessible to assessments of costs and benefits. In a word, much more tangible than plans for flood control and irrigation. However important the latter may be in the future, they are at present, to say the least of it, slightly vague. So I think I should come to the end of my presentation. So let me just tell you, or give you a glimpse of the end of this story. There was this huge dam built. It was misdesigned and mismanaged. At the same time, it was the backbone of the electricity infrastructure in Tanzania. There was a draw at the beginning of the 90s, just 1 year before the first free multi-party elections. There was power rationing in Dar es Salaam, so the government looked for a way to provide emergency power. They contracted a company from Malaysia in a also not very transparent way, so to say, who was supposed to build a diesel generator in Dar es Salaam. This diesel generator, or this diesel power plant, was built 10 years later. There was a lot of delays also because of alleged corruption. And it is the most expensive diesel power plant on the continent, but TANESCO has to purchase the power because they have a PPA with them. They are buying it at 35 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour in times of drought when their own power plants don't generate enough. But they sell it for 12 cents, which is, or even a little bit more now, $12 per kilowatt hour, which is like a political tariff. So this has been, this power plant has held the power sector in Tanzania hostage for like 15 years now. I can tell you more about this dead end in the break, but yeah, I'll be happy to like engage this historical perspective in the debate later.
Okay, thanks very much, Jonas, and we might ask you to stand up here still. Maybe I have time for a few follow-up questions. Perhaps we can collect them actually. Yeah, so we'll collect 2 or 3 questions, and then you can answer them.
Yeah, just want to clarification on the outlook for independent power producers today, because it wasn't clear to me whether there was just one that somehow had achieved the monopoly situation, or whether it's actually pretty good from the perspective of an IPP planning to invest or develop.
Question about IPPs. That's one. Yeah.
Your study is on Tanzania and the historical perspective of electricity access. Do you have a comparison between this and how it developed in the a country like USA or Britain or any of that sort? See how is it different?
Comparison with a Western country. Any other questions? Yeah.
Could you make already kind of perspective what you would say, taking historical experiences, you know, what are, you know, maybe the positive and negative scenarios of a country like Tanzania?
Okay, I think some pretty challenging questions. I'll ask you to.
Enough
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll try to make it short. Regarding to IPPs, actually there has been a paradigm shift in the last years. There's these bad IPPs, the big IPPs that have like so expensive power and they are
contested also in the population. And then because of them, because of the generation being so expensive, this has opened a whole new space for SPPs. So Tanzania is probably one of the countries with the most advanced regulatory framework for small power producers. And this is also because of the fact that TANESCO, the national utility, is happy about every customer who's not connected to them in a way, or who's supplied by someone else. Or they're happy about any like electricity fed in at a lower rate than 30 to 35 to 60 cents. So this has, in a way, has been also a chance, but it's still it's been eating up all revenues from TANESCO in like the last years. It's only changing now. They have new generation projects. Also, they have overcome this ideological barrier between like people in favor of the state-driven sector and people in favor of the private-driven sector. It's become more pragmatic, but still the conflicts are there. Your question was about a comparison to Western countries. I'm not doing a systematic comparison, but there's one thing we should really keep in mind, that rural electrification projects in the West also have been highly subsidized political projects, which took a long time and which were not done. They took about 30 years from 1930 to 1960 in the US. So we just have to keep in mind these projects have just started in Tanzania, in a country like Tanzania. They have simply not started yet. There was no such, there was a like program called rural electrification since the 60s, but this was more about kind of top-down approach to electrifying the countries first, the district capital, or province capitals, and the district capitals. This was not about the idea to bringing electricity to the rural villages. There were 8 villages out of the numbers here, out of 8,600 electrified in like in the definition of village, electrified in the early 90s. So this has simply not started, this project. It's not there. Sorry, your question was about the outlook. Right now, or lately natural gas has been found, offshore gas in Tanzania. So there's a big bonanza right now. And there's a very short anecdote from one of the last conferences there. Before the background of this very expensive IPP power, someone from the audience of this conference asked the Minister of Energy, why wouldn't you introduce feed-in tariffs for solar? They're competitive, absolutely competitive, if you look at this 35 to 60 cents. And the energy minister said, why would we do that? We will get cheap gas in a couple of years. And we will generate it far below 10 cents per kilowatt hour electricity. So that's the big danger that the next silver bullet to solve all these problems is in place now. And this is like the discursive hammer to really keep any rural electrification attempts, also like attempts by SPPs, low. So we have to work on that level as well if we want to be successful. We have to lobby on this level, and there's some lobby. There are some lobbies also for renewable energies in Tanzania. They're doing good work, but it's still a long way to go to really get to the decision makers at this stage.
Okay. Okay. Thanks very much. Give him a hand. Maybe we can consider giving Jonas his own conference next year, right? Because I'm sure he has enough stories to tell. Okay, so now we've moved from a sort of an overview of rural electrification in the first paper to a sort of an in-depth historical analysis of a specific country in the second paper. And I think now we might be moving on to maybe thinking more in terms of solutions, right? And thinking of, instead of only providing energy, what else could we provide the people? So please, Arvind, come up to the stage, and look forward to hearing about your paper.
Thank you. So the paper is about the energy plus approach defined by UNDP and how we see it in the context of handloom cluster, livelihood cluster in Pochampalli, Mandal, a block level. It's a block where the handloom cluster is there in Andhra Pradesh. And so in the Indian context, give a brief background, like there's still 300 million unelectrified households. And in terms of the definition of the definition of electricity has evolved over the period. It has evolved from saying that the infrastructure is there in the villages to 10% of the households being electrified, to consider a village as 100% electrified. So it's like in some of the definitions over time, it was also said that even if none of the villages in the house, none of the households in the villages were electrified, a village can be considered electrified, completely electrified. In 2004-2005, the definition had been changed, and the condition that at least 10% households should be electrified. That's when what the interesting thing happened was in 2004-2005, the percentage of households electrified had fallen to the previous census that happened. And later in the 2004-2005, what we got was the RGVVY program, Rajiv Gandhi Vidyutikaran Yojana. It's kind of a 100% electrification to India. A lot of emphasis was put on it, and they defined electrification to a BPL family. I'll use the word BPL. It's the below poverty line households which they consider. Generally, it's defined by a ration card that they have, a white card, from which they get the subsidized food and all. So anyone who has the white card is considered a BPL family. And they defined it as a single light point. And generally these light points are put on the where a minister or someone passing by can see and say that it's there. So it's generally on the outside of the house. So does the lighting point suffice the definition of electricity access? And secondly, does electricity access mean productive use? Does it really lead to the productive use? Does it give any kind of income augmentation to the household? That's something we'll see through the UNDP Energy Plus approach. The Energy Plus approach talks about the amalgamation of non-energy inputs and energy inputs in order to trigger productive use. So the entire the circle that we see here, what I'm calling it is they define it as the energy poverty trap. And what they say is that it's kind of a paradox wherein a BPL family who's trying to break free of that needs to graduate to productive use of energy, and in order to graduate they need to be able to afford modern energy systems. So if I need to use a motor in my field, I need to have more money, and if I need to, it's kind of a paradox kind of a thing. So what they talk about is, to break the paradox, you need another variable. That's generally the non-energy inputs. I was seeing Catherine's slides and even the World Bank. It captures pretty effectively that institutions, I think it's the highest rated. I think the electricity was the second in the slide that you had shown. And they call the first one, wherein the basic energy needs are addressed, the minimalist approach, wherein cooking, heating, and lighting are considered. And the second one is the energy plus approach, wherein we talk about non-energy inputs. They define non-energy inputs as access to affordable finance, safety nets such as insurance, pension, and institutions, community-based organizations such as SHGs, in cooperatives. And they also talk about how, if these two are combined, we can break that circle of energy and poverty. And my paper is based on the, like I said, it's based on the handloom cluster in Pochampalli. That's where it is. And it's a district in Andhra Pradesh, erstwhile Andhra Pradesh. The reason why we chose Andhra Pradesh is because the Andhra Pradesh is the state with the highest network, the largest network of community-based organizations. It has 12 million people under the SHGs, all women. And the research has been to identify complementary inputs over and above electricity that has encouraged productive use of electricity among households, and to determine what were the agents that brought these non-energy inputs to the households. So the methodology, I need to explain what is the organization called SERP before I go into it. It's the Society for Elimination of Rural Poverty. It's a state rural livelihood department. It's a department under the state rural livelihood in Andhra Pradesh, and they are the ones who first initiated the SHG movement in India, and SERP is the knowledge bank for National Rural Livelihood Mission across the states. It's kind of the sensei for the rest of the states. And the reason why we selected this cluster was this cluster had access to electricity since 40 years, 3 decades. And this cluster had a large representation of handloom weavers, which is an unattractive option of livelihood currently as defined by the Planning Commission. And we use the definition of non-energy inputs as these. It's livelihood services, partnerships, dedicated support institutions, and human and social capital in terms of the staff that is there to help them out in building this network of SHGs. This is the slide. This is a reference from the National Rural Livelihood Mission. And how did we define households receiving non-energy inputs and not receiving non-energy inputs is that SHGs are generally graded based on their attendance, their number of meetings, the internal lending that is there, the savings that they have, and the grades of A and B are considered as receiving non-energy inputs, and anything higher than that is generally considered a relatively lower percentage of non-energy inputs. And apart from that, there is a project called Krushi. It deals with the micro entrepreneurs in Andhra Pradesh, and it, along with the Cheneta Color Weavers, it's a mutually aided cooperative of weavers, and the Chetana Society, which is the NGO which was facilitating this formation of the cooperative. We consider any household which falls under this project or in the category of A and B graded SAG as receiving proper non-energy inputs. And in case of households which fall in the grades of C, D, E or F, generally the bank loans and other facilities keep coming down when we go down the grades. So that's the reason we say relatively low non-energy inputs. And anyone outside the project of Krushi is also has been considered as receiving relatively low non-energy inputs. And the evaluation of the two groups was based on the simple thing like average household income, the increase in income to the baseline year of 2000. Why we took the year 2000 was because the advent of SERP happened in the introduction of SERP happened in 2000. So the flow of non-energy inputs we can say happened since 2000. So that's the reason we took the baseline year as 2000. And graduation towards productive use has been measured based on the usage of motors, usage of mobile phones in terms of adding to their business. So these kind of anything that is beyond lighting has been considered as a productive use. Then we have asked the households to grade the non-energy inputs that they have received along the life cycle of the development of the product. If he's a handloom weaver, if he's developing a sari or any kind of a material, what are the different inputs that he received at different stages of not just the product, but also the stages of the entrepreneurship, and how does he associate that with the development of his enterprise. So the results were the site A is the site which received the non-energy inputs, and the site B is the one which did not receive it. It's a clear indication of the differences because the geographies are pretty close, so there is no geographic bias also. The only thing that was missing in site B and site A was the institutions and the flow of inputs. So we see the clear difference in these site A and site B. Yeah. And we also talked about the income increase. We also see that the site A and site B, if we talk about it, there was a clear difference in the number of people who said that there was an income increase. This is the first one is the household which said there is an income increase. Second is there is no difference. Third is who said there's a decrease in income. So we clearly see that the site B suggested that there was no change at all. The site A suggested it's almost half of the population of the households sample who said there was an increase in income over the baseline year of 2000. And in terms of productive use, we see that based on the project that was undertaken, we talked about households who were falling under the project supported by the mutually aided cooperative, the NGO and the government together, the partnership. They had the facility of availing low-cost finance, and they were able to purchase what is called the chipkey machine. It's used to yarn. It's a yarning machine, and what it did was that it's called a productive use because it's actually electricity driven. That actual task takes around 2 to 3 days if it's done manually, and so we see that there's a clear difference between site A and site B and how they could graduate to a productive use of electricity. So if you consider that 2-3 days in terms of the Narega is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment. It's an employment guarantee act, and each state has a different metric for it, the per day wages. Based on that, it's around 274 to 411 rupees as an opportunity cost. And these were the rankings that were given by the households from site A and site B. Market access, training, quality raw material supply, and institutions and startup finance were the inputs that got the maximum weightage in site A. And in site B, what we saw was they talked about proximity of market, support from close quarters, market rapport, one-time training that they received from a cooperative, and again proximity of market. It's more of a geographic thing, and in terms of personal relations. If you look at site B and site A, what we see is all these inputs were driven by institution, which is the SHG and the SCRP. And we see that all these have been like the access to startup finance. You get finance at around 0% interest rate, you get it at 3% interest rate, you get it at 12% interest rate from the banks. 3% is from the community investment fund, 0% is also from the government. So that's again from the institutions. In terms of quality raw material supply, it's from the project that we talked about and the machines that they got from the association with the project. And training is a continuous thing that is happening over here, wherein the skill building is happening, the design is happening. And market access, they have currently branded their the work under a brand called Karga, and it has an online presence as well. And what they have said that there is an increase of 30% over the market price in the livelihood cluster in Pochampalli, over and above what the Site B participants were talking about. So we talked about this, and mainly the common denominator is electricity. But what we see is that the effective institutions hold the key. I think I need to rush.
Just maybe come to your conclusions. Yeah.
So So mainly the recommendations are building community-based institutions should be the primary non-energy input. Energy Plus approach talks about number of inputs, but it does not specify a particular order in which the input should be introduced into the communities which do not have the access to electricity or the financial aspects. So based on this research, what we found was that building institutions is the first way to channelize the rest of the inputs, and that should be the next level of discourse that should happen. Then we should leverage on the network of institutions for optimal delivery and utilization of the non-energy inputs. And the development goals and electricity access, they both should not be dealt in two different boxes, but they should be combined and they should be addressed. And this is kind of a recommendation for the policymakers. Then the conclusion is that the channelizing non-energy inputs through effective institutions and institutional partnerships accelerates the process of income augmentation for the rural households.
Leave it on. Okay. Thanks very much, Arvind, for I think a very interesting research on non-energy inputs. So again, let us collect a couple of questions, and then before we move on to a more general discussion. So who can I give the microphone to? Who wants to go first? But I might go first myself in that case. I was wondering, like, to which extent do your recommendations are similar or different for grid electrified places and, for example, microgrids or individual solar home systems? Can you say anything? And then in the meantime, people can think about other questions.
Another cluster also that was covered in this research, and that was a fisherman cluster in Andhra Pradesh. It is you're talking about the decentralized supply, and they have currently started using, and generally that is considered to be the strongest. Andhra Pradesh is considered as the best for institutions, community-based institutions. And in Andhra Pradesh, it's called the Godavari Mahasamakya. It's the river there, and it has more than 2 to 3 lakhs fishermen households over there. And this cluster has now graduated they started using solar freezers, and they've started using solar dryers. So it's kind of what I see is that the institution again is the key over there. I think it might answer.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Okay, we have one more question. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is related to one of the slides you've shown when you explained in the different scenario, or not scenarios, but different settings, A and B, what has been the impact to their income. You highlighted there that 50% of the households reported in the side A that there is an increased income. Basically, I was more wondering about the fact that in both cases, 30% of the people said that they have a lower income afterwards, or I didn't get it maybe probably. What did you try to investigate what has been the reason for this, that there's some kind of negative impact, because that strikes me more in a way.
What we saw when it started, the presentation I talked about, we selected the livelihood cluster based on the presence of institutions, the access to electricity from at least 30 years, so that we can evaluate it based on non-energy inputs. And what I also pointed out was that we have also selected a livelihood which is not attractive. As in, this handloom is a dying art in India, and it's kind of those households which have gone beyond repair who have reported generally that 30% is almost about to go out of the profession itself. They are more linked to the cities, and they explore other professions rather than staying in the hand. They're kind of a beyond repair kind of this households. Does it answer?
Final question or not? Yeah.
Yeah, with respect to the same slide, so you told the non-energy inputs, which are the finances, right? So you're telling they use those finances to productively use the electricity, right? And then they have a profit. Is that what you were showing that?
You can also use those.
It's kind of the SERP, which drives these institutions, does not restrict any member in the SHG to how they use the finance. There are certain guidelines, but if the village organization approves that I want to pay my child's school fees, it's still agreed. But the presence of a NGO and the presence of a cooperative, and there is also a proper project called Knowledge Partners, wherein the Chetna Society is an NGO which was guiding these weavers on how to invest their money. So it was kind of in that input as well. They were able to access the relatively lower finance, as well as they had access to other non-energy inputs as well. They had insurance, they had health facilities, better health facilities, they had coverage on, they had scholarships for their children. So it was a complete package. It wasn't a single thing that led to that. That's what. But the very first step was institutions. If institutions were not there, this wouldn't have happened. That's the reason we are comparing both of them. Institutions were there in the second one also, but they are not properly operating. That's the reason you have SHGs in bad grades.
Okay. So thanks very much. Give him another round of applause for a very good presentation. Okay, what we might do now is take another 15 minutes of your time, right? I hope that's okay, because also you came 15 minutes late, so that seems fair enough. Open up for a broader panel discussion. In particular, well, we were perhaps a bit too ambitious, but we would like to also hear some input from you. What might the social science questions be around microenergy systems, or indeed sort of these broader questions about grid versus off-grid, the grid versus microgrid. So I'm not sure how we're going to do it. If anyone still has a sort of a good question or starting point for the panelists, we might just start with that and see how we go. And in the meantime, I'm trying to write along with anything I hear. How about that? Who wants to kick off? Question or otherwise, yeah. Otherwise, what I might do is get the panelists themselves to respond to each other's presentation. Would that be a good way to start? Yeah. Who wants to go first? Yeah.
Thank you. Maybe I have some thoughts to your presentation. I think it was a really good insight, and I think where there's some overlapping aspect was in the last comment you made when you said now they found these gas resources. this will kind of hinder the good development with the micro scale solutions. I think that's in a little regards the same what is happening in some countries with the grid. Like when I've been in West Africa, I was in Cameroon and Nigeria, and there it happens that when people talk about bringing electricity to the rural countryside, they just talk about grid extension. And I think it's really still important to have in mind that not everyone is having it already present in their heads, that there's this opportunity to do something else as well. And this is really hindering the development there as well. So I think it's always very important to look at the location-specific challenges, as we also heard from your presentation. So I think this showed really nicely how there are opportunities from India, or where you can start from there.
Yeah, so maybe as a consequence, I mean, this is probably not so much in regard to research agenda, but also like what should project developers do to, or how can they take this into account? So I think it's important to better understand this discourse, to better understand how they work, to better understand where the people come from that take the decisions, to understand what are the places where the discussions and discourses about energy supply take place, and how to enter it, and how to provide the right arguments, and how to speak the language of those who are actually who are making this policy. Because otherwise you'll stay in the niche, and there's like you don't get outside the niche, and you go into the field and you implement your projects and you do your stuff, and then you get out and you realize, okay, it is somehow not becoming part of the big picture. But this is more like an appeal, and I think for that you need some kind of more systematic investigations on how these kind of political discourses work.
Myself, coming from Germany, and so far I could say a Western country where we have a fully established energy system. However, we have now much more decentralized, distributed kinds of energy sources in the system, and I guess one of the major conclusions out of the last 10, 15 years of this development in Germany is in fact that people started to be convinced about these alternatives that are out there, and they did it. And while doing it, you know, they also made this become an issue, discussed it, found ways to do their own lobbying activities, not waiting for any policy or any top-down actors getting involved in that, and letting then policy becoming into the position of reacting properly, and finally making these policies that are now supporting or mainly supporting these kind of processes. So now, referring to what could be a question for the MES agenda, you know, how far, or where do you see the gaps in, or where are the gaps, you know, from in the social context of these countries, you know, to make processes like this happening? While on one side we see already a lot of activities on the micro level where obviously alternatives are ongoing, while from the top side it seems so that basically these are a lot of hot words but nothing happens. And what is in between these, you know, actors that usually push those processes and maybe can bring this to a broader agenda and basically becoming a real policy then? Yeah, I just want to take the opportunity to balance what you said there, Daniel. I mean, we do need to recognize that Germany has had stable and predictable feed-in tariffs since the early 90s and preferential grid access. So in fact, I would turn your statement around and say maybe policy is where it has to start, rather than it'll come by itself after stakeholders organize themselves into lobbying groups and what have you.
I have to agree with him on this subject. The feed-in tariff, I think, is the only reason that people started investing, other than the people that were lobbying for the feed-in tariff. But I mean, the implementation was with the people, because it's an investment more than they actually think of the environment and the future and sustainability. I think this is the main course. So I think it's policy related. Another question is, I don't understand now, I got confused of the decentralized concept, because I don't know what do you consider a decentralized energy system in Germany? Because now I'm getting more confused. So if we need from that.
We don't need confusion, so quick clarification.
Clarification regard to comparing it with our target countries here. Of course, here it's basically having decentralized means very a non-grid connected supply, while in Germany it's basically that you have decentralized generation. So that's basically what the part that is decentralized, what I was referring to. The grid is there, so this central structure, you could say, it's developed, and referring to, the point when we had feed-in tariffs. That's the phase I was referring to. That was the break even in that regard. I totally agree, But however, the time before, that was the time when I started getting in these things involved and was basically seen as people who are nerds and visionaries who are basically sick because they have a vision. That was the message those days. However, yeah, please let the podium, the panel also answer.
Coming to the point raised, like if we talk about Germany and if we see it in the context of underdeveloped countries, maybe if we can see it in the perspective of the Maslow hierarchy. If we talk about Ethiopia, Tanzania, India, people who do not have access, it's kind of a need. And in Germany, like you were saying, they already had grid access and they also had the feeding tariffs also given to them. So it's kind of a self-actualization for them, and then they moved into decentralized systems. So if we talk about these underdeveloped countries and where the reach is not there, should the approach be different, and maybe the inputs from historical perspective will give better idea on how do we approach them. And coming to one of the points that you raised on location-specific solutions, I'm also working in Ethiopia, but even in Ethiopia, the driving force is again the institutions. In India also, where we work in Andhra Pradesh, it's the institutions which are driving the force, like what we saw in my case study. In Ethiopia, it's the cooperatives, wherein they started sharing the incentives with the cooperatives, and the institutions are again driving the access of even decentralized systems.
Maybe one short, historians remark on that question of Germany and this chicken egg question of what comes first, like regulatory framework or the policy discourses. So I think these feed-in tariffs in the early 90s, they didn't come from nowhere, or they didn't come from, it was not a bunch of smart Germans sitting around a table and deciding that this, very visionary people deciding that this might be the best way, but this was like discursive history starting in the 70s, and actually I think it came out of the anti-nuclear movement, and this was like the breeding ground for the people, for the ideas, and later for the people who pushed this process. And smart Germans. So there was a political party lobbying for this. There were a lot of entrepreneurs coming out of this breeding ground, this anti-nuclear movement, who are now among like the biggest entrepreneurs in the solar field. So it's not something it's not something we can design, but something we can try to understand. And for example, Fukushima has done more to phasing out nuclear power in Germany than dozens of whatever political agendas or like a so just to like get the picture. The question is that we can't probably blow up another nuclear power plant to reach our goals, but the question is how can we enter this discursive level?
Want to have one or two closing remarks? I saw one hand there. Harshit, or did you have a? No. Please.
Like say our work specific or time specific, like say a farmer, he just needs the electricity just to pump water. So he just needs it for that. He doesn't need it for anything else. I mean, to address the immediate need. So I think it should be planned that way. Say in India, if an industry works in the night, they have a different rate for them. It's a much cheaper rate provided to them. So I mean, I think it should be divided such way so that it can satisfy the immediate requirements. So that's what I feel. I mean, that thing should be done. I mean, So that if it satisfies their immediate requirements, then yeah, they can go up a little, they can scale up a little. Then maybe, you know, that would further help for development. That's what I think.
Okay. Any final other burning comments, questions for this panel? If not, then I think I'd like to wrap up. I think we've. Oh, you want to? Okay. A question. Okay. A final question.
Kind of final question, probably just to take or as a food for thought. So also hearing there have been so many like technical debates on scale. I've heard during the conference and other conferences, and I wonder, like, this is probably an item for the research agenda, how we can connect these scale debates, which are talking about what's the most efficient way, what's the best way to do it, with let's say political scale debates, which is like a totally different thing and different perspective, but it's equally important. And I think there has been like little attempts to do this really in a systematic way. We probably cannot answer this right now, but it's something we should probably take home.
I think I do think it's a very relevant question, and I do think we have a very nice start of what might be a social science research agenda. So, indeed, for next conferences, I hope some of these questions can be taken up, can be more integrated. I also hope our viewers at home might still come up with some input or some reflection on this session. We would love to hear from you. That said, I think I want to thank you all very much for being here. I want to thank the speakers very much, in particular also Jonas for organizing the session with me. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.